guys, it's Kelly here and I'm back with another video. Today's video is featuring some products from Trinity Stamps. I am using the sketchy floral stamps and dies, this skinny stripe background, and then I'm also using these little heart dies. So a while ago, probably about a month or so ago, I did a video talking about just like tips for heat embossing, and I told you guys that I really wanted to kind of do some like back to basics videos. And so we're going to be doing a little bit of that today. I'm going to stamp two of these sketchy flowers to complete my design, which we're actually going to end up getting 2 cards out of it. That was not my intention, but that is how it worked out. And because I am helpless to just pitch them into the trash can, we made 2 cards. So I am part of, which I'm sure you guys probably are too, if you're on like Facebook or, really, is it just Facebook? Yeah, I mean, anymore, like that's where your groups are. So I'm part of a couple like crafty groups, card making groups there. I should note, I am stamping this in Hero Arts Intense Black ink, and it is safe for alcohol markers. That is how I'm going to be coloring my florals. If you are here because of the video, which is talking about tips on how to stamp bigger, like larger stamps, you're going to want to jump to like, I think like the 15-minute mark, because I have to do my coloring first. But anywho, so in one of these groups, there was, I think it was actually Gina's, Gina K Designs, I think is where I saw it. And this lady had a Misty, this qualifies for any kind of stamp positioner, I think. No, I guess not. I guess these don't have removable parts. I guess it just qualifies for the Misty. But anyway, so she had a large stamp. It was a large floral. It wasn't even a background stamp. And she was like, I have stamped this thing so many times. I've, done all the pressure. I've stamped it repeatedly. Because if you've ever used a stamp positioner, one of the benefits is that, everything stays in the same spot for the most part. You do have to double check it. And that means that you can stamp it multiple times, which for those of us who have been in this hobby for a really long time, that was not always the case. Clear stamps, you pretty much had to stamp with acrylic blocks, and it was like hit or miss. It was one shot. That's all you got at it. And trust me when I tell you that I ruined so many cards, because I would do like a whole scene card and then I'd try to stamp my sentiment and it would be just trash. So Misty really was game changing, and people have their own feelings about it. You're welcome to your opinion. I use the Misty. And so but anyway, she was talking about how she was having a really hard time getting a good impression and she couldn't figure out what she was doing wrong. So I thought that would maybe be a good place for us to start. Let's go back to the card. So here, I've done my darkest shading. I've done my darkest color and then my dark mid-tone. And this is supposed to be my light mid-tone. This is actually my lightest color. And you're going to see that I'm going to color all of these before I even realize that I am, like, here's where I realize when I go back to do the next color and I'm like, oh man. So I did have to go back in with the RV06 and do all of what I intended to color with it and then go back to the RV04. There's some of them, there's 2, which actually that one doesn't even end up being a petal. I was having, because sketchier images can be a little bit more challenging to figure out what goes where. I was having a hard time figuring out the petal situation over there. And then when I ran it through, with the die, it cut a portion of it out. And I was like, oh, I guess you weren't a petal, were you? But that's okay. So anyway, she was just having a really, really hard time. So the first thing that I noticed when I was looking at her picture was that she did not have the black foam piece in her Misty. So that was the first thing I noticed right out the gate. Like, you need to have that piece in there. The second thing that I noticed was that it was a much larger stamp. And those can be a little bit tricky. So we'll talk about how to stamp larger stamps if you don't have a positioning tool. We'll talk about how to stamp them if you do, and then we will talk about how to kind of like line them up and different things that would be helpful for those larger stamps. So, until then, we have some coloring going on here. Now, I have not used this stamp before, but it's been on my list to use. We all have a list, don't we? And I thought that it would be kind of fun to do like a darker, like kind of pop of color card. I'm going to be really honest with you. My original intention when I started this card was to do navy with maybe like a coral. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, ooh, I've really been doing a lot of kind of more muted tones. And that stripe, that skinny stripe background really just screamed at me to be a black and white stripe. And so I ended up changing it. I have no regret. I have no regrets. I love the brighter colors with a pop of black and white. And it's just a really good way to get a eye-catching design without having to like do a lot of work for figuring out your colors, because anything that's bright or brighter with a black and white is going to look really nice. Just because you have all that contrast. So the way that I did these, I did do the stripe in the background, and then the other one has a black background. But you could use a darker color. A navy would have worked here. The problem that I had was that I didn't love the navy stripe. The navy stripe, I tried it. The navy stripe looked like my grandpa's pajamas. That's what it looked like to me. It looked like my PawPaw's pajamas. Funny story. Well, I guess we can do we can do a little bit of story time, right? We got a lot of time to kill. Again, if you're a person who's just here for instruction, jump to that 15-minute mark. If you're a person who's here because you like to hear stories, surprise, I have one. So my grandfather was a hard worker. He worked to support his family. Him and my grandmother had 4 children, and my grandmother, for the most part, was a stay-at-home mom. She picked up odd jobs here and there. She was a waitress. She taught Bible study at the church. She worked. Yeah, she worked for like a hot second, I think, at American Greetings. But anyway, but really, she was, as a lot of women were back then, she was a homemaker. And she, of course, used to watch other people's kids as well. Because back then, people actually had a village to help raise their kids. So he worked, and he would have to get up very early in the morning. And this is something that he maintained well into retirement, was getting up early. My dad, who has been retired now for almost 15 years, is the same way. Like he had to get up, he had an early job. He got up early in the morning. My father was a pipe fitter, so his jobs were always moving, and it would take, a different amount of time to get to each job site. But even now, my dad's still very much an early riser. My mom, who it was always a night person, but switched to day shift when she had kids, so she could see us, she reverted directly back to being a night person, which I imagine is how I will be, when my kids are older and I don't have to get up super early to get them where they need to go. But anywho, so my papa always went to bed early. But the thing is, he didn't care who was there. He did not care who was there. My grandparents lived in a ranch style home. They did have a basement, but everything else was on one floor. And so they had a hallway where the bedrooms and the bathroom were, and the hallway had a door. So when it was time to go to bed, like it didn't matter who was there, what they were doing, nothing. When it was time for him to go to bed, he would go change into his jammies, which were very frequently pinstriped. And then he would come to the door. He would say goodnight. He would tell us that he loved us. And then he would shut that hallway door and he'd be down the hall to bed. No matter what was happening. It really did not matter to him. It was bedtime. He was going to bed. But then he was, like I said, he was an early riser, and we spent, if you guys have watched my channel, you know that we spent summers at my grandparents' house when my parents were working and I was young. So they would, my mom, when she went back to work, my mom went back to work when I was in like 6th grade. When she went back to work, she would drive us to her job. And then when there was like a Bob Evans when you got off the highway, so they would meet in the Bob Evans parking lot. My grandfather would meet my mom there because she worked down the street. And then we would hop from one car to the other car and he would take us home. If we were really, really lucky, we would get to spend the night, mostly on the weekends, because Graham would be like, Nancy, let him stay. Or we would pretend to sleep. I don't know who we were fooling. Nobody probably, because, you know, they knew. But we thought we were being, you know, sneaky by pretending to fall asleep. And sometimes I would pretend to fall asleep and I'd actually fall asleep. But anywho, when we would spend the night, because my papa got up so early, he would sometimes on Sunday mornings, he would go get us sausage biscuits. And that was like our special little treat when you would get up in the morning. He would have gotten McDonald's. But he was always up way earlier than everybody else. But back then I was an early riser too, because I was a kid. So I'd be up by like 9 a.m. And then Graham and I would watch Sally, Jesse, Raphael on Mondays. True story. That's true. That's true. But anywho, yeah, the stamp, that's how we got on the topic of this. Totally did not even mean to tell this story. But that reminded me of my grandpa's pajamas. And so it just was not giving me the contrast and the pop of color that I was looking for. But I really do like this stamp. I think it's super fun. I love the kind of sketchy feel it has to it. Some of the florals, like these smaller ones, almost look like little berries or thistle or maybe some hydrangea, but they're drawn in a way that, you know, you wouldn't necessarily really be coloring them. So for those, I did stippling so that I could add some color, which is just a series of dots just right on top of each other. And then, of course, you guys know how I roll. If you've been here before, I'm going to go in and add my detail with my white gel pen. This is a number 10. So I'm adding some dots to the center of the flowers for the ones that you can see, like the stamen especially. But then also the ones that are more open, that looks like what, like kind of like a daisy. I added some dots there, pretty much to all of them. And then I'm going to die cut it out. Now I did color 2 of these. I'm also, here's where you're going to see the little bit of navy. I also cut out a large heart out of my navy cardstock, and I'm lining it up straight in the middle on purpose, because that way I will be able to utilize that other piece of cardstock. Colored cardstock is expensive, y'all, so I'm not wasting it. If I'm going to cut something out, I want to make sure I'm still going to be able to use that piece. But ultimately, I didn't end up liking the navy, so that is now in my scrap pile, which I will use for something else in the future, and I switched over to black. In the Sketchy Florals, it has both of these sentiments. It says, "Thank you, you've brightened my day," which I think is a really nice kind of thank you card. I originally was making the thank you card because my mother-in-law needed a thank you card from a friend of hers that had sent her some crafty notebooks. She needed a thank you card, and ultimately I didn't end up getting them finished in time, so she picked another card out of the stash that I already had that was completed. But here, so I've stamped it one time, and then I'm going to move that cardstock down just slightly so that I can stamp it a second time. I am stamping in white pigment ink. I believe the one I'm using is from Hero Arts, but I like the one from Honeybee equally as well. And I'm, of course, treating with my anti-static tool beforehand. And then I like to ink mine up twice. I stamp it 2 times. Same thing with the embossing powder. This is white detail embossing powder, and I like to apply this twice as well. This white detail embossing powder is also from Hero Arts, and I am running low, which is why in order to do it twice, I have to dump it all back into the container and then do it again. While this is going on in the background, I am preheating my heat gun so that way when I bring it to the paper, I reduce the amount of warping because it starts to melt almost immediately. And then once that is melted and cool to the touch, I will use the dies to cut them out. The thank and the you are separate, so you can, what is the word I want? Arrange them anyway. Arrange. Why was that such a hard word? Anyway, you can arrange them any way that you want. And then we have the one that obviously cuts out the second part of the sentiment, which is you brighten my day. From there, I will die cut out both of these, and now we are going to get into talking about stamps. So I did not have a large background wooden stamp. They are still out there. They do still make them. But what I wanted to show you was here. Do you see how underneath the red rummer there is a foam piece? This was originally almost the way all stamps were. I mounted on a wood block. And then you have that foam piece that gives you a little bit of give so that you can get a good impression. Now, when I first got into stamping is when cling stamps first came out. And cling stamps is this, which is basically that has the foam, and you pull off your cover sheet. This gives you, it's not sticky to the touch, but it will stick to surfaces, like non-porous surfaces, like your Misty door, or in my case, my glass mat. If you do not have a stamp positioner, before I owned one, this was my go-to way of stamping large backgrounds like this and being able to get a good impression because you only have that one shot. So I would put it down flat, I would ink it up, and you want to make sure that you're very generous with your inking. In this case, I'm using black soot, Distress Oxide. Distress ink stamps like trash. It's great for a lot of other things, and I love distressing, but it's not good for stamping. Distress Oxides have a pigment property, so they are. Here, you're going to place your cardstock down. You don't want to move it around. Wherever it lands, it lands. And then I'm going to use a scrap piece of paper. I'm going to put that over so I don't get my hands inky. I'm going to hold the sheet with one hand, and then with the other hand, I'm going to move around and press firmly, just to make sure I'm getting a really good impression over all of the edges. Then I'm going to switch. I will remove my scrap piece, and then I will be able to pick up my cardstock, and I will have a pretty good impression for one shot. This was the one that I had the best luck with. Now, if you have a stamp positioner, your cling stamp already has this foam piece in it. So you don't need the foam. And in fact, it won't fit well if you leave the foam in. So if you're using a cling stamp in your Misty, you want to remove the foam. Then you will put your cardstock down. In my case, I am using my Sweet Petunia sticky mat, and that's going to hold my cardstock in place and make sure that I can get an edge-to-edge stamp. Those work really well for me. There's other, I think, sticky mats out there. I don't know if they fit in the Misty or not, but this one's made by my Sweet Petunia, so I know it does. So then the same thing, I will ink it up and I can stamp it down the same way I would stamp anything else with that foam removed. The benefit of this is because it is in the Misty, we don't have to rely on that one shot. We can stamp it as many times as we need to, as long as we're double checking to make sure that sticky mat, or if you're using just cardstock, that cardstock hasn't shifted. So here I'm going to bend my sticky mat so that I can get the edges up, and then here's the one we stamped twice, here's the one we stamped once. Both of them are usable and I would totally use them. This stamp is from Hero Art, but I didn't use it in my design. I merely used it so I could show you the difference. So now we're going to move on to clear stamps, which you're seeing more and more of for these large backgrounds because clear stamps are much more popular now. For the clear stamps, you need the foam. You have to have the foam because it raises up your surface, but also it gives you that cushion. With a clear stamp, there is no cushion. So here, this is my skinny stripe. This is the one we're actually going to use on our, well, not this one, but the next one we'll actually use. So here I'm putting my cardstock in place. I'm going to peel my clear stamp off. I am going to line this up. Again, I am using my sticky mat so I can have my design go edge to edge. And I'm just going to pick this up like any other stamp. And I'm going to show you why this creates a problem. So I'm going to push it down, and you can see even here, but you can definitely see when I lift it up, it has all these air bubbles in it. If you don't get rid of the air bubbles, this was one of the problems that this lady was having because she just picked it up with her Misty Door. If you don't get the air bubbles out, you cannot get even stamping. And because when you close the door, it kind of seals the edges first, you end up with all this trapped air kind of in the center. So I'm going to ink this up, and I'm not going to fix the air bubbles, and I'm going to show you how it stamps. When we ink it up, it looks like everything is perfectly inked. It looks like there should be no reason why this wouldn't stamp properly. But we know there's an air bubble. So when I go ahead and remove it, my clear stamp did stick to my sticky mat. You can see that even though there's ink on my stamp, you can see it. It did not transfer to the cardstock because of that air bubble. So we have to get rid of it. In order to get rid of the air bubble, once you pick your stamp up, you want to lift it up. You don't have to lift it off completely because you want it to still be lined up, but you want to lift it up and release the air and then gently lay it back down. That way there's no opportunity for air to get trapped underneath it. And then when you ink it up, it should stamp properly. Now, depending upon the kind of ink you're using or how much pressure you apply, my ink pad is shedding. You can see I'm going in there and like pulling the fuzzies off. My ink pad is doing a little bit of shedding. But once it's properly inked and we press it down, it should give us a pretty good impression because we've gotten rid of those air bubbles. So here I have a pretty good impression. Everything seems to have stamped well. There is just a couple of spots at the top. So I'm going to stamp it a second time because that's the benefit of having a stamp positioner. But if I did not have a stamp positioner, I could absolutely still use this piece. I would maybe just be more aware of where I put my design elements to maybe cover up where I missed a spot or two. I don't have to worry about it because I can stamp it twice. So I went ahead and did that. It filled in all the blanks and now we're good to go. If you're worried about over stamping onto your sticky mat, you don't have to. It cleans up with a rag. So here I've got all my pieces parts and we're going to start building the card. I am absolutely 100% using this piece of cardstock that I cut my sentiment out of because I only trimmed off 1/8 of an inch of my striped background. So that's all I need around the edges, and then I won't have to waste a whole piece of cardstock. I told you guys in the beginning, I'm cheap. If you're new here, I'm a cheap chicken. It's fine. If you know me, then you already knew this, and I'm not telling you any facts that you don't know. Plus, I'm going to mount this on a card base, and nobody will be able to see that anyway. So there, I've got my my striped piece down. I'm going to put down this white heart. It is a little bit larger. It's the next size up in those kind of layering dies. And this is going to help kind of break up the design so that my flowers aren't competing with everything else that's going on there. I chose to pop my flowers up. You see I have these two pieces here. I chose to pop them up. You certainly don't have to, but that is my game plan. I am going to pop them up with some foam tape. I'm going to spare you the vast majority of the boring part of me figuring out where my foam tape needs to go. I do keep setting it back on the card and just double checking where I need foam tape at. I tried not to take it all the way to the edge because then when I trim off the other piece, I'll have to cut through all that foam tape. There was, I think, one little piece that I ended up having to trim off. These little scissors, these little gray scissors are from Spellbinders and they are non-stick and they work really well for cutting through things like foam tape. So here I'm going to adhere that down in the bottom right-hand corner, and I can see that there is a little piece that needs to go into the corner. So I will just bend the flowers back, put that little foam piece in, and then turn it around so that I can trim these off. Here you can see that's me cutting through just the little bits of foam tape. And then I'm not going to throw these pieces away. We spent all this time coloring these flowers. Like, there's 0% chance I'm not going to try to figure out something to do with them so that I don't have to throw them in the trash. And I would also highly recommend that you do the same. There's nothing wrong with creating 2 cards out of, your leftover bits. So here I've done the same thing for the florals that are going to go catty corner from this. And again, I'm going to put them down. I'm just feeling to see where my foam tape is. I'm going to put these down into the corner. And then once again, I will put in any foam tape that I need into the corner. Trim that however I need to, as well as pull off the little release paper. This one, I had there was a gap in the die, intentionally, of course, so I couldn't run the piece all the way across the bottom without it sticking out the part that was die cut. So I did have to cut it into 2 pieces, and then I just pulled the release paper off and pushed them down. Once again, I will just trim off these outside edges and then go back to rebuilding the rest of the card, keeping, once again, my little piece. So now the 2 pieces are actually opposites of each other because of the way that we laid them down on the card. For my black heart, the smaller black heart, I'm going to pop that up as well. It will sit flush on top of the florals because it's the same width of foam tape. You absolutely could raise it up. I didn't think that it was necessary, so I'm going to put some glue on the back, and then I will put it lined up with the white heart right over top of the foam tape that we've put down. And then this is what's going to create our focal point, which is where we're going to put our sentiment. I like to lay out my sentiment beforehand so I know exactly where I'm gluing everything, and this way everything, isn't moving or shifting. I can pick up with my tweezers each individual part of the sentiment, add my glue, and then put them back down. I did use the same sentiment for both cards, even though we got 2 kind of different looks. They're sisters, not twins. Like, they're not identical, but obviously they use the same pieces parts. And if you're a person who's into giving card sets, or you're making, multiple types of cards, which I will be here soon, that's a story for another video. These things are great, like using the leftovers so you don't have to put in quite as much work. So that is card number 1. I'm just getting my sentiment straight, and then we'll move on to card number 2. So I told you, remember, these little floral pieces are actually 2 separate corners. So the part that is missing out of them is in fact the middle. So you could use it a couple of different ways. You could lay them on top of each other and then put something over that missing piece, and it would look as if you had the full stamped image. So here I'm just lining them up to show you, and then this white heart is not quite big enough to completely cover it, but it'll give you a general idea. Alternatively, you could arrange them, where they were not lined up and, they were coming outside of the heart, and put another piece, maybe a circle or something, over top of them, so that you could, get the full feel of the stamped piece without actually having the full stamped piece. So that is not how I chose to use them today, but that is an option. I chose to kind of hide them behind, I don't want to say hide them because they're still my focal point, but I chose to adhere them behind my heart. So that way my heart is now, like on the other card, the florals are popped up and the heart with the sentiment is popped up. Here, the actual part of the black cardstock would be the portion that is popped up. And I'm just going to make sure that I am laying them down so that they go edge to edge. And it's just going to give me another look, that's different than the original bouquet, but will still definitely, well, I don't want to say, yeah, I guess I do. They will still match. They'll coordinate, if you will, with the other card. So, and then that will completely fill that little heart. I'll trim off the extras. There was 2 small pieces that I ended up pitching, these 2 small pieces that we trimmed off. But that's okay. Comparative to just pitching the whole thing that I spent all that time to color, I'm fine with that. So my black piece looked a little plain. I kind of went back and forth about what I wanted to do, and ultimately I decided that I was going to create a little frame around it. And I did this by holding the die in place and then tracing around it with my white gel pen. I do have, what do you call them? Like the little nubby pieces that stick out from the die where you like clip them. So I am having to work around those. My mistake was one of them I actually drew around it instead of skipping it. If I had skipped it, I'd be able to just fill in the thin line, but I didn't. I drew around it and you can see it. So that means I have to go in by hand and make it a little bit thicker. However, if you don't want to do that, you can trace the die and just skip those parts. And then once you remove the die, you would just go in and then connect that line, which is, I think it looks fine, even though the line is a little bit thicker. It was just a little bit more time consuming because I did have to go in and thicken up that line. Once that was done and dry, I am getting out my foam tape, and this is the part that I'm going to pop up. This is slightly smaller than an A2 size card. Once again, I just trimmed it so that it was like 1/8 of an inch. So we'll have that white border in the background that will complement the white that we see within the heart, but also the white heat embossing that we're using for the sentiment. So you could very easily turn this into a shaker card if you're into shaker cards. You just pop a piece of acetate in there and make sure that your foam tape went all the way around your heart so that it wouldn't drop your shaker bits. But I chose not to make it a shaker card. So once I have my release paper pulled off, I am going to go ahead and add some liquid adhesive. This isn't necessary for it to stick, but it does give me a little bit of wiggle room if I don't get it on the first try. Those foam tapes are very, very sticky, and sometimes it's hard to get them back up if you don't get them lined up exactly where you want them the first time around. So I'm going to go ahead and line that up, and then once I have it where I want it, I will push my foam tape down securely. I love the black and white. I can't help it. It looks so good. So I added my sentiments down at the bottom the same way that I did the first one, and then I used the, I don't remember if they're the moonstone, moonlight, or they're the Aurora Angel ones. These are also from Trinity, so I used those, and then also with my glue press, because it has a fine little tip on there. So I used that to accent my sentiments, and then of course I added a little bit of glitter to my flowers because I can't stop myself and I love all the glittery shiny things. And then that is going to finish off both cards for today. So thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope that it helps you when you're trying to use those bigger stamps. Or I guess just, I suppose we did a little tutorial for the Misty as well unintentionally. But anywho, thank you so much for your time. I always appreciate it, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Bye.